Welcome back. So this is the second half of our fifth lecture on Hinduism, Modern Hinduism today. And we're going to talk about now, the last one was about caste and women's roles. And this one we're going to talk about reactions to pressures from outside, how Hinduism has reacted to the interactions it's had with other traditions. If we recall, we've talked about the geological layers of Hinduism. It begins with the Indus Valley civilization and then the Aryan and Vedic religion that appears around 1200 BCE, philosophical Hinduism with the Upanishads, devotional Hinduism with the Gita, and then modern Hinduism. Modern Hinduism, which is what we're going to talk about today, is marked by the conversation Hinduism is placed in with Islam, the British occupation, globalization, and modernity. So we're going to begin with the Islamic conquest. It is difficult for me to imagine two religions that are as different from each other as Hinduism is from Islam. For example, Islam is strictly monotheistic, so much so that Christianity is, its biggest criticism of Christianity is the Trinity, because it sees Christianity as not sufficiently monotheistic, but it has also leveled criticism at Judaism, claiming that it is not sufficiently monotheistic for Islam's taste. It's iconoclastic, which is part of that monotheistic bent. You're not supposed to have images of God because that is to ascribe godhood to something that is not God. God is God, and to think anything is God but God is blasphemy. It's the core problem of the universe as they see it. Whereas Hinduism is polytheistic and filled with images. Everywhere you look, there's primary colors with statues and deities, etc. It believes that idolatry, shirk, is the most heinous of sins, whereas puja, the worship of an idol, is the primary mode of worship for devotional Hinduism. The Muslims have no problem eating beef, whereas Hinduism venerates the cow and finds it to be deeply offensive when someone eats beef. For Islam, the goal is submission to Allah, whereas in Hinduism, the goal is renunciation of the world to achieve liberation versus salvation in heaven if you're a Muslim. Salvation in heaven would not be the goal if you're a Hindu. You don't want to be reborn in heaven. You want to be released from the rebirth of samsara. So that idea of judgment versus reincarnation is also doctrinally at odds, although not as much practically. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was the leader of the Islamic League, as I believe, during the time of Indian independence, argued for a separate state for Muslims, to separate the Hindus from the Muslims. And this is the argument he used. They are not religions in the strict sense of the word, Hinduism and Islam, meaning, but are in fact quite different and distinct social orders. Now, I disagree with his definition of religion in that sense. I think social orders are religion. That's what a religion is in many ways. But he says it's a dream that the Hindus and the Muslims can ever evolve a common nationality. What he means in that social order bit is that it's not like this is a religion that I believe in and you can believe what you want. This is more than just what I believe and what you believe. It's how we believe society should be structured. So I don't think that makes it not a religion, but I think that is an important point. How you believe society itself should be structured makes it difficult to live together if you believe society should itself be structured in a different manner. It is a dream that Muslims and Hindus can ever evolve a common nationality. The Hindus and the Muslims belong to two distinct religious philosophies, social customs, and literature. They belong to two different civilizations, which are based mainly on conflicting ideas and conceptions. To yoke together two such nations under a single state must lead to a growing discontent and final destruction of any fabric that may be so built up for the government of such a state. So this was his argument for partition. He also argued that Islam is specifically unqualified to be in a multicultural sense connected to Hinduism. Mahatma Gandhi, who again we'll talk about in a bit, argued against this and said he wanted a multicultural state. where the Hindus were respectful of the Muslims were respectful of the Hindus, and they all lived together in happiness. Muhammad Ali Jinnah said that's impossible, specifically because Islam does not view a distinction between religious and civil authority. Now, that's an argument that a lot of conservative Christians in the U.S. have made, that we cannot live in a multicultural state with Muslims because they believe that their laws are not just individual laws, but they're social laws. They're how the state should be run. There is no distinction between individual and state law, and that makes multiculturalism difficult. Here we have a Muslim making that argument. So whatever that is worth, I think there's something at least worth considering in that argument. In fact, the other thing we ought to realize is that when we talk about the Muslim-Hindu conflict, we often think of Islam as a Middle Eastern religion. In reality, the most populous Islamic country is Indonesia, followed by Pakistan, then Bangladesh, and then India. And of course, at the time of the division, Pakistan and India were the same nation. So Islam is there's a highly large population of Muslims in the area we're speaking of that have to somehow live next to a large population of Hindus. The Umayyad Caliphate, by 750 AD, had reached down to the border of India. So this is the history of this. I'm not going to go through a lot of the military bits of the conquest, but by 750 they were knocking on the door, and by the next century Muslims were next 2 centuries Muslims were ruling in India, at least in the north. There was a caliphate set up, and Islam had control of most of India, conquered but militarily. Muhammad bin Qasim was a member of the Umayyad Caliphate, and he offered Hindus, a statement of religious tolerance. And this is interesting because Muslim tradition has this concept of the people of the book. Those are Jews, Christians, etc. They believe in the Bible and in the Torah and in one God. And according to Islam, we are all worshiping the same God. They believe that. We believe that usually. Muslims and Christians are worshiping the same God. We just believe God wants a little different things sometimes, but we're all worshiping God. What Christians fail to do is realize that God is one and doesn't have a son, and we've missed this idea of Muhammad as God's prophet. And we need to accept those things, but until we do, we can be granted religious tolerance. Polytheists and idol worshippers, however, are condemned to death by the Torah, or by the Quran. So the Quran says you can tolerate a Christian because they're people of the book, but you should kill the polytheistic pagans. Clearly, Hinduism seems to me to immediately qualify under that category. However, we have these Muslim rulers, including Hindus, in this category of people of the book. And it's not clear exactly why they do this, but it's possibly for political expedience, but it's also possibly because in discussion with some of the more philosophical Hindus, there was some realization that at least some set of Hindus believe that all these gods are just manifestations of the one true God, and there is a tradition of monotheism underlying the polytheistic tradition of Hinduism. And so in certain Islamic traditions, Hindus have been granted a religious tolerance, the same sort of religious tolerance that Christians were given. This is important because it sort of sets the lie to this idea that they cannot live together in peace. However, we are dealing with a situation where the Muslims are in charge. They set the rules. We are living in an Islamic state where Islamic law dictates how people should live, and Muslim and Hindus are then tolerated under that Islamic state. But it should be pointed out that for many generations, Hindus and Muslims lived together in tension, but relative peace, under this same idea of granting them religious tolerance. So again, in this couple centuries, we had a caliphate in India. The capital was in Old Delhi, and the Islamic power was concentrated in the north of India. So even today, there are far more Muslims in the north, and there are far more Hindus in the south of India. The Sufis were the most successful at proselytizing the Hindus. So obviously Muslims tend to try to convert people. That's part of their religious tradition. But the Sufis seem to have had the most success in their proselytization efforts of Hindus. There's probably several good reasons for that. One is that they are all, to some degree, they seem pantheistic. The Sufi mystic tradition at least believes that God is one. God created the universe. God can't create something other than him without dividing himself. So underneath it all, we are all God, and God is everything. And so that idea is very similar to the sort of thing we see in the Upanishads. So there were similarities there. The Sheikh and the Guru are very similar figures in Islamic tradition. So there was a reason that they were familiar and comfortable with that. The Sufis were willing to use the vernacular language. They didn't try to force everyone to use Arabic. And they had a lot of success among lower castes and also those seeking social mobility. Even if you're in a high caste, but joining the religion of the conquering and the ruling nation is often a way to move yourself up. Obviously, the lower caste people were attracted to the Islamic idea of equality. Islam, if it does anything terribly, terribly, terribly well, it's very good at teaching that people are not different because of their race, etc. And so they would have rejected the caste system completely, and lower castes were eager to join that sort of thing. A syncretic society with syncretic architecture, poetry, and even some religious discussion happened under this Islamic rule, where Hindus and Muslims came in contact and came in conversation, and they discussed religion together, and there were even caliphates who would invite Hindu sages to have debates about religious traditions. And it created a certain flowering of society when these two traditions fertilized each other, cross-fertilized, that really flowered under the Mughal emperor Shahjahan, who built the Taj Mahal. So if you go to the Taj Mahal, this is the epitome of that sort of syncretic culture that was created through Muslim-Hindu interaction. Starting under Akbar the Great and then flourishing under Shahjahan. I don't know how to say his name, Shahjahan. So we're going to skip over the British occupation because it's going to get its own little thing and just jump into the modern conflict that has to do with the division of India and Pakistan. We've already discussed that. The division reminds me, I think it's impossible to think about it without contemplating what was happening in Israel at the same time. At the moment that India became independent, Israel was becoming independent at the same time, just after World War II. And in both cases, a decision was made to divide the land between the two groups. In India and Pakistan, that division held. There are now two nations. It's almost a vision of what you could have in Israel with the two-state solution.
Three nations,
however,
Bangladesh was Pakistan, but now it's Bangladesh.
Okay. So, however, there is still conflict. So this wasn't an ideal solution. There was a lot of upheaval as people moved from nations, and there was some social cleansing, ethnic cleansing that went on during the division. And they are still fighting over certain regions of disputed. There are disputes in their borders, and we now have, and I think this is one of the reasons it's important to understand religion, because we have a religiously driven conflict between two nations that are now both nuclear armed, and they're living in their own small Cold War, etc. But to some extent, I believe this was a more successful solution than what we saw in Israel, where one of the nations refused to accept the partition and invaded the other instead. In one instance, this is a good example. Again, it has parallels to what's happening in Israel. But one example of when this conflict boiled over was the destruction of the Babri Masjid Mosque in Ayodhya. And it was traditionally the birthplace of Rama, but there was a Muslim mosque sitting there. So again, it's very much like the Dome of the Rock, where there's an Islamic mosque sitting in a place that another religion that was there at some point before believed was one of their sacred sites, and a temple belongs, is what they believed. It's not at the same stakes, because in both cases, this is the most sacred spot for the Jews and one of the three most sacred spots for the Muslims. And in this case, it was just a mosque. and it was a sacred spot for the Hindu people. But it was destroyed. A mob came and they destroyed this particular mosque, and it erupted in riots where both Hindus and Muslims killed thousands of people were killed in these sorts of riots, and this was in 1992, so not that long ago. But this is the sort of thing that is still going on in India, etc. So, what we need to do now is talk about the British occupation as another. Well, I guess we're going to back up. Hinduism, the conflict between Hinduism and Islam is sort of the background noise to almost all of our discussions of modern Hinduism and also modern politics in India. And so it sets the stage for the sort of things that follow. The British occupation came when the East India Company arrived in India, and they were interested in spices and trading. It was a commercial enterprise for them, but they defeated certain of the Muslim rulers there and began to control India as a company. The company was actually in charge for many years, and then the British Crown itself took over in what's known as the British Raj or rule in 1858, and that lasted until independence in 1947. The British often favored the Hindus over the Muslims, and so this created, as you can kind of imagine, a certain set of ambiguity in how Muslims viewed, or how Hindus viewed the British Raj. To some extent, they were given preferential treatment, and they were liberated from their Muslim rule, overlord, and oppression. On the other hand, they were placed under a colonial system, which had all sorts of problems, as we all know, and many of them wanted their own self-rule. And so this created a certain amount of ambivalence. But under British rule, they were introduced to English literacy, the concepts of liberty and equality, which were in counter to their concepts of caste. And what we want to talk about is how each of these concepts, how they react to each of these concepts. Nationalism was also, at least of the British sort, was a new idea that influenced Hinduism, and we should also add, led to the movement for independence. So to some extent, the British brought their own nationalism with them and introduced it to the people that they ruled that then wanted their independence. It also introduced them to the Enlightenment, science and reason, Victorian prudery, Anglo-American Protestantism, industrialization, urbanization, Western materialism, and globalization. So if you think about just some of those, when we talk about industrialization and urbanization, it is much easier to throw off a caste system if you're living in a city instead of a small town where everybody knows everybody. So urbanization brought about an environment in which it's possible to consider rejecting a caste system. When we think about materialism, Hinduism had always taught that the ideal in life was to transcend this world and worldly goods. But if materialism comes along and says, no, it's actually good to have material and there's some value in this life, then maybe what you want to do is transform this world instead of transcend it, and that can spark an entire movement for social justice. Because I don't just want to transcend this world, I want widows to be happy in this life, and I might want actually some material success if I'm an untouchable. And so in that context, each of these things, including the literature of the West, the concepts of liberty, influence in future Hindu traditions and beliefs, and still are doing so. One is this idea of prudery. We had an entire lecture last month on sexuality and ritual sexuality in Hindu society, including the Tantra, etc., Tantric tradition. After several generations of British rule, they were exposed to a large amount of what I would call Victorian prudery. And today, if you speak to a lot of practicing Hindus, they will either see nothing erotic whatsoever in the Shiva Lingam, and if you show them something that is obviously erotic, they will often be embarrassed by it, or that part of their tradition is something they want to distance themselves from. And it almost eliminated Tantra as an interest in some parts of India, as a practice. And so they were very influenced by Protestant prudery. And you remember last time I said one of the things I admire about Hinduism is that they don't have that prudery. Well, they do. It just comes in later through this through their interactions with the British during British rule. And this is one of those things that I would consider to be unfortunate. Mark Twain said, Hinduism is a vast museum of idols, and all of them crude, misshapen, and ugly. So you have to think of what Hindus do as they become exposed to, quote, the great literature of the West, including reading people like Mark Twain. But by the way, Mark Twain also said that the Book of Mormon is chloroform in print. So I'm not terribly surprised that he would say this sort of thing about another religion. But how does a Hindu believer react to that sort of belief and statement? Well, there's a couple ways people react to this sorts of thing. And it's the same sort of thing that the West is struggling with. We are also struggling with religion that is interacting with modernity, science, reason, and the Enlightenment. And so the way you do it is there's usually two kind of general responses, and they're polarizing, and it's one of the reasons we live in a polarized society today. One is liberal religion, or you abandon religion altogether, and the other is fundamentalism. Because the Enlightenment says you can take a book and you can kind of scientifically study it and tear it apart, and when you do that, you realize maybe the book isn't as inspired as you thought, and you create a liberal view where it is only inspired in as much as it is reasonable or in as much as it is, verifiable, that sort of thing, which is exactly what liberal Christians did. Liberal Hindus began to do the same thing with their tradition. The problem is, if you're a believer in that book, then suddenly your book is being challenged. And in a society where, in the past, a lot of these texts were viewed metaphorically, once its validity begins to be challenged, you double down, and a lot of the metaphorical readings go out the window, and you begin to literally interpret everything. And so what the irony is, under the influence of the Enlightenment and science and reason, it's often true that texts that were always intended to be metaphorically interpreted begin to be interpreted literally instead. And so we have this almost polarizing view where the middle drops out, and people double down on their beliefs and begin to believe in young earth creationism, if you're Christian, and giving Christian examples of this idea so you understand them when we talk about the Hindu examples. So you either become a young earth creationist or you become a Unitarian Universalist, and you kind of vacate the middle. So in that liberal set, one of the main drivers was this idea of multicultural religious unity. So in Hinduism, there are many objectives in life, right? We talked about them just a second ago. There's pleasure and there's dharma, but there's also moksha, release. Well, so there's many objects in life, but one ideal object. There's many paths to one goal, moksha. We talked about those too. You remember there's the karma yoga, karma path, but there's also the Jnana wisdom path, and then there's also the Bhakti path. So because they already believed in multiple ways of achieving enlightenment as the main goal, it made sense to them to then look at other religious traditions when they were exposed to them and say, hey, that's another path to liberation. And it may be imperfect. They may not even know they're seeking liberation because they may be claiming they're seeking salvation. But if they experience God at the top of the mountain that we're all climbing, they will achieve liberation. And so a Hindu could look at Christianity and say, that's just another path up the same mountain that I myself am climbing. They collapsed all the many gods of Hinduism into one God, so they also had experience with that, right? Each of the gods were just different manifestations of one God. So it's easy to look at Christianity or Islam and say, that's just another manifestation of the one true God. And so they were able to, because of those other elements in their tradition, collapse the many religions into one religion. And this is one of the origins of this idea that all religions are one. It comes primarily out of Hinduism and India, and it's now permeated kind of the New Age philosophy in the US and other places. But it grows out of these traditions that are uniquely set to do this with this. So this is one reaction to exposure to other traditions that Hindus have. They just collapse them all into different paths up the same mountain. They have, again, in their texts, they have reason to do this. The Rig Veda says the truth is one, but the sages call it by different names. And so they even have religious scriptural justification for this sort of collapse. This idea is epitomized by Ram Mohan Roy, lived 1772 to 1833. He founded the Society of Believers in Brahman, or the Brahma Samaj, in 1828, and this was this is kind of the epitome of this all religions are one movement. He studied at a Muslim university. At first, he was opposed to the British occupation. So, what are reactions of Hindus to the British occupation? Well, at first he was opposed, but then he actually was employed by the East India Company. He read a whole bunch of English literature, was influenced by things like the Bible, and he actually came to support British rule. And he was influenced by Sufism, Unitarianism, and deism to create his tradition, which is this idea that all religions are one. He said there is only one God, and that God is beyond description. And because of that, no one religion has a monopoly on religious truth, he reasoned. So all religions are flawed humans' efforts to capture this one divine. Now, I should point out, I did this when I had 2 lectures a long time ago on religious unity, where I talked about the similarities, the sort of thing you see in all religious traditions. And I had another lecture on religious differences, where I talked about the things where religions are different. This idea is a statement of faith of the Brahmo Samaj, and that's fine. It is not a very good description of these religious traditions. They inside of themselves would claim that they're not all the same, that none of their differences matter. They would think their differences matter. But as a statement of faith, you can look at these other religions and make your own statement of belief and say, I believe the things that are common are what is true, the things that are different is what doesn't matter, and that's my religious belief. And that's a very admirable sort of thing to do, and this is the sort of thing he did. Another example of this is this man named Ramakrishna. He actually said that he had visions of Krishna and Jesus. He claimed they were both real gods, and he claimed that there had been, their teachings had been misinterpreted. But once you got back to the original teachings of these religious teachers that he had found in vision, they were actually the same. He practiced his own versions of Islam and Christianity and Hinduism, and he claimed, whereas Monroy had claimed that they were all one through his reason. He'd used reason to come to that conclusion. Ramakrishna claimed that they were all one, and he knew it through his own experience, meaning he'd actually climbed the path of Christianity, he'd climbed the path of Hinduism, he climbed the path of Islam, and he realized they all led to the same top of the mountain, which for him were these visionary experiences he was having with the divine. So there's a bunch of these Hindu sages who epitomize this idea, some more famous than others. Those are the 2 most important. But their ideas live on today. In Houston Smith, where he wrote about the world's religions in that famous book, he claimed they were all essentially one and the same. Karen Armstrong writes a lot about this sort of thing, where she will compare all religions and say that the differences don't matter. Essentially, they're all the same. And they are very much channeling this spirit, which has moved into this aspect of religious studies, but also into kind of a New Age tradition in the West. Another practitioner of this sort of belief is Mahatma Gandhi. He is considered incredibly important by people in the West. We think of him as kind of the father of independence, but most people in India do not think of him that way. And so what his political views, though, were primarily religious in nature, not political. He had political things, but for him, what he was doing was seeing the political arena as a valid place to practice religious karma. And he had many diverse influences that impacted him in his life, including he was impressed by the Sermon on the Mount. He talked often about the New Testament. He was impressed by the writings of Tolstoy, the Bhagavad Gita in the New Testament, and the Jains. He was influenced by Jains who lived near him as he grew up, and they taught him ahimsa, which is this idea of non-violent, non-harming nonviolence, which he embodied in his teachings. Now again, in the West we see him as very important because he influenced people like Martin Luther and this sort of thing. But in India, he's often seen as less important than we see him. He was assassinated by another Hindu who thought he'd given away too much to the Muslims during the quest to independence. He championed independence, but he did so through his philosophy of nonviolence. He called it satyagraha. And let's see, that means grasping truth or holding on to truth. He claimed that just ends, this is what he meant by that, just ends could never be attained through evil means. He believed that in revealing the brutality of oppression to the oppressor by bearing the brunt of the oppressor visibly and calmly, and that required the discipline of a yogi. And so it's present in his name. Mahatma means the great soul. Mahatma Gandhi was a religious figure then who used his yogic practice to demonstrate the oppression of the system he was in to the oppressor through nonviolent means. And that was, again, one of those things that influenced people in the U.S. and the civil rights movement. He was definitely a multiculturalist. He was educated in England, and he didn't want or believe that religion should be divisive. And so that's why he opposed the partition of India and Pakistan in comparison to the individuals we've read before that who favored them. We tend to think, I think, of Hinduism in the West through our exposure to its philosophy and the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and this sort of thing. And some of my teachers often said, Hinduism is always just absorbing everything it touches and not rejecting anything, and it doesn't have a sectarian bone in its body. And it's, but that is embodied in the people we've just discussed, Gandhi and these other reformers. I should have also mentioned Gandhi was essential in trying to outlaw untouchability, which eventually happened when all the untouchables were essentially added to the lower caste legally, but has not actually filtered down into practice, in part through his activism. But all that stuff about multiculturalism is great, but it's not universal. Hinduism has its fundamentalists too, and they are often epitomized by Swami Dayananda Saraswati. He founded the Arya Samaj, the Noble Society, in 1875. In this case, we are, again, reacting to British rule. And we're also reacting. This was formed about the same time fundamentalism got its start in the U.S. He claimed that Hinduism was superior to other religious traditions. He claimed that other religious traditions have some truth in it, but they're approximations to the pure truth of Hinduism. And then they reacted to suspicion against the agents of change that were influencing their society. So let's look at Scripture, for example. When challenges to the biblical tradition arose, Christians sometimes doubled down on the authority of Scripture. He did the same thing. He claimed that the Veda is the only authoritative Scripture. And so he kind of threw out all the other tradition, all the other books, the epics and all that stuff. He denied the authority then of the Gita and the Mahabharata, these later traditions. It's this, let's go back. Right? So just like Martin Luther, let's go back to the Bible and let's get rid of all the traditions of the Catholic Church. So he's going to go back to the Veda and let's get rid of all these traditions that have accumulated. And the Scripture is authoritative all on its own, and all you have to do is read it, and we'll all come to the right conclusion because it's obviously true and it's inerrant and authoritative. So he actually went further. He said the Veda is the source of all truth, including scientific truth. He thought like all of science and stuff was embedded in the Veda if you could see it in its hidden meanings. He thought it should be available for all to study. Again, that sounds very much like Martin Luther. Of course, that's interesting because the Veda was originally secret. Only the Brahmins could read it, but he wanted everyone to be able to read the Veda. Again, this sounds much like the Catholic thing where the priest would read the Bible and teach people, but in the Reformation, everyone should be able to read the Bible. Well, that's what he was saying with the Veda. He did want to reform Hinduism. Specifically, he championed monotheism. He believed that the Vedas actually taught monotheism and that the polytheism in the Vedas was an allegory for the monotheism that lived underneath. He disliked puja and pilgrimage. He thought they were superstitious. This is a reaction to the Enlightenment. and the rationality and the Christian critique of Hinduism. And he's living that critique and trying to find an answer. And instead of saying, well, paganism, polytheism, worshiping many gods, the statues, that's all good, we're going to defend that. He says, well, it's not really in the Vedas, so let's just get rid of it. That's the easiest way to defend it from these attacks. He even denied the divinity of Vishnu's avatars, like Krishna, etc. And he denied the jati as a subcaste. He believed in caste, but not the jati, because that term doesn't show up in the Vedas. So it's like, that term isn't in the Vedas, we can get rid of it. He was interested in social reform. Unlike most kind of fundamentalisms as we think of them in the U.S., we often think of fundamentalists in the U.S. as opposed to women's rights, etc. He was actually an advocate for some social reforms, including better treatment of women, widows should be allowed to remarry, etc. But he is most known for his intense nationalism. And again, that nationalist idea was brought to India by the British, but he incorporated it, and he believed in this intense form of nationalism. He believed that the British should be removed and that they should rule themselves, obviously, and that their culture society was actually superior. So we take it another step further, and that they should. And this is known as Hindutva. That movement, that concept is Hindutva, or Hinduness. They would call themselves champions of Hinduness. And today, kids will often call them fundis or fundamentalists in India. Children, if you ask about them, they will talk about the fundis. But they would call themselves champions of Hindutva, or Hinduness. They oppose secularization. They oppose Christianity. They oppose Islam. And they even came to political power in the 1980s. And there are at least 3 different major political movements in India that all reflect this sort of political nationalist fundamentalism, etc. And again, like I said, in 1980, they won political control at the turn of the century for a time. This sort of fundamentalism was exported to Sri Lanka and erupted in a civil war that killed 80 to 100,000 people, again, through this sort of Hindu fundamentalist nationalism. So if we talk about common responses to modernity around the world, there's often a tendency to become more liberal, to seek multiculturalism, etc., or to fall into fundamentalism. And we have seen both of those things happen in Hinduism's response to modernity. I should say most of the Hindu people we meet in the U.S., in the kind of diaspora of Hinduism, tend to favor the liberal multiculturalism as illustrated by Gandhi, etc. That's the sort of Hinduism that they embrace. But the militant nationalists exist both in India today, but also in the diaspora. And it's the sort of thing we're facing in the United States. We see it with the religious right today, and it seems to be a universal sort of problem that we see everywhere we look. So let's also briefly talk about Hinduism in the West, and then we'll be done. And in this sense, I mean how Hinduism moves from India to the United States and how it's been embraced and practiced here. Obviously, some people have moved here from India, but there's also been a certain amount of conversion that has happened in the West to Hinduism and Hindu ideas. Initially, the West had a very mixed impression of Hinduism. I think it still does. And part of it is from the philosophical scriptures. Those were translated early, and many of the intellectuals, Henry David Thoreau, Emerson, read them and were deeply impressed by the Gita, the Upanishads, and their view of Hinduism was that it was this deeply philosophical tradition filled with great wisdom that they agreed with, read, and were deeply moved by. And then there were people who went as part of the East India Company in British occupation, and they would go to India and then they'd come back to the West, and their impression was very different. For them, it was more like Mark Twain, this collection of idols, and all of them misshapen. And so the aesthetic was so different from what people in the West expected that they often reacted very badly to what they were seeing when they visited. And so those two reactions, coexisted and often spoke past each other. People would often talk about Hinduism as this horrible thing, or they would talk about it as this great philosophical tradition with these wonderful religious texts. And those two views persisted alongside each other. And then the missionaries began to come. Although I think Swami Vivekananda would disagree with my term missionary. He would have hated that idea. But he was a student of Ramakrishna. Remember, we've talked about him already. He's one of the people who believed all these religions were just different paths up the same mountain. And he came to the West. He was probably the first. In 1893, he spoke at the First World Parliament of Religions and made a huge splash. People were very impressed by his intellectualism, the intelligence of his argument, this passion of his argument, but also he spoke with what they called an elegant Irish brogue, which seemed to have endeared him to many of the people at the conference. And people were very impressed, very moved by him. He stayed. He gave many lectures, went on a lecture series. He spoke specifically about how all religions were one, how we should all get along. He promoted a multiculturalist approach, and he specifically said we shouldn't be trying to convert each other, which is why he would have disagreed with my term missionary. However, he convinced many people in the West to agree with that position. And in that sense, he was, in fact, a missionary of non-missionarydom.
Proselytizer is a better term?
Yeah, proselytizer of non-proselytizing, maybe. Another one is Swami, how do I say this? Bhaktivedanta, 1896 to 1977. He founded the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, or ISKCON, commonly called the Hare Krishnas. If you remember, before they prevented people from going into airports, I actually was given a flower by these guys back in the day. And in fact, they also gave me my first copy of the Bhagavad Gita, which I still have. So I was passed out of Bhagavad Gita by the Hare Krishnas. And they're a group of people who promote specifically the teachings of the Gita and Krishna in the Gita. And they've made an impact in the West because a lot of people have joined their society and been moved by the sort of way they proselytize, which is to go around and they pass people flowers, pass people books, and they've been influential. I'm just giving you a sampling. There's a whole bunch of these, right? But there's Mahari Mahesh Yogi. He's the guru of transcendental meditation fame, guru to the Beatles. So if you've heard of transcendental meditation, he's where that comes from, and he promoted transcendental meditation in the West, which a lot of people practice. And so he's been influential. This one, I actually got a copy of this autobiography of a yogi to listen to in preparation for this class. It was fascinating reading, filled with all sorts of miracles. He said his mother, for example, was meditating and a metal amulet appeared in her hands that she then passed on to him with miraculous powers. He talked about a guru who could manifest beautiful smells and make fruit appear on a table. He talked about another guru he met who could be in two places at once. He's just filled with all these mystical experiences. He had all these encounters with gurus who convinced him that there was something beyond the physical of life, and he began to pursue God. He describes God as this one thing that permeates everything, but he also will speak about the different incarnations. He talked about Kali and worship of Kali, and so he's very much embedded in this whole polytheistic, monotheistic synthesis. It was a fascinating book. He started the Self-Realization Fellowship, and his autobiography inspired a whole bunch of people, including George Harrison of Beatles fame. Ravi Shankar is a sitar. And also Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs says he reads this book every year. Once a year, he will read through this book and finds it deeply inspirational for whatever reason. I was, as more of a rationalist, I found a lot of the claims in it incredible and impossible. And he often would pepper his philosophical and religious musings with what I would consider pseudoscience to back up the sort of things he advocated. But this has been an incredibly influential sort of text, so it's worth at least thumbing through at some point if you haven't read it, because it's been so influential. All of these things, there's been let me do this and go back. There's still a continued mixed reaction to this, right? These gurus that I've discussed, including especially this one, these people became a countercultural hit, right? Especially in the 60s. And so a lot of them thought this was the solution to a hodrum materialist Western society. We can escape materialism, and these people were our key out. Other people thought they were cultish and dangerous. In some instances, they were. We have instances where all sorts of horrible things happened in some of these societies that they formed. But then it even moved into sort of a popular movement, which is, I think, sort of where we're at today, that has taken up shop in yoga studios across the world. So, it's turned into sort of self-help. And so, remember, yoga is supposed to be a way to yoke the self and the divine, but it's become an exercise movement. However, every once in a while, your yoga instructor will often pontificate on the deep teachings of Hinduism. And so we have today a New Age culture of spiritual but not religious people who encounter Hinduism through the Upanishads or discussions of them, although they rarely read them themselves, and through their yoga studios and yoga instructors, where it's become a bit of a popular movement. And so, again, the reception in the West of Hinduism is this mixed bag still. It started as a mixed bag, and it's still there, where we have these, countercultural rock stars, a group of people telling us how cultish and dangerous it all is, and a popular acceptance of some aspects without a real deep understanding of what it all is and what it all is about. So that is my final lecture on Hinduism, and so like I said, I'm sorry to see that topic end. I had a lot of fun doing this. It was fascinating, and if you have any burning questions, we can still discuss them. Next time, what I'd like to do is talk about the anthropology of religion, and by that I want to talk about different approaches, not just ones we all believe, but what is the history of how people have scientifically approached the study of religion, from Freud to sort of the more more modern approaches, and go through how people have unpacked religion as a general principle, and then we'll dive back. I like to go deep into one religious tradition, kind of back out and talk about the study of religion itself, and then go back deep into another religious tradition. So if you have ideas for which religious tradition to do next, let me know. We'll spend at least a couple classes talking about the general study of religion and the history of the scholarship of religion as a field of study, and then we'll dive into another tradition. And let me know what you want to learn about next, and we'll do that after this. So thank you for coming. I appreciate it, and I will see you later.